So there are three things I'd like to talk to you today. There are three concepts. The first one is called ephemeralization. It's a very, very big word. It took me 5 minutes to learn to pronounce it, actually. Okay. The thing is, rather than try to just point you in some direction, I would like more to challenge some of the assumptions that we have in our industry with practical examples. So this is one of these examples, and I'd like to also to talk about the implications. Now, this thing called ephemeralization was introduced by this gentleman, Mr. Richard Fuller, who was an architect, an inventor, and a philosopher. And the concept is apparently quite ambitious. The concept is do more and more with less and less until you can do everything with nothing. Okay? Sounds strange, right? But I think that especially in our industry, we are masters of ephemeralization. It's happening in architecture as well, I mean building architecture as well. But in our industry, I think we are master of that. And I'll give you an example. Now, the thing that you can see on the screen, that was one of the keyboards that I used 25 years ago. And it was actually, it was one of the keyboards I used because the shirt on the picture was mine. Okay, it was me in the picture. But I will save you the rest of the picture, okay? Just a keyboard. And that was one of the keyboards that I used. It was an IBM 3270 terminal. And the keyboard was an interesting piece of hardware, a very substantial piece of hardware. It was made of solid steel. It weighed about 5 kilos. You could probably use it to break through a jewelry window if you want. I never tried that, but I suspect it could work. Okay? So it was a very interesting piece of hardware. And this one is one of the keyboards which I use today. Now, for me, what's interesting is not that it's lighter and smaller. What is really interesting is that there is no keyboard, right? There is the glass surface, which sometimes I use as a keyboard, but sometimes it's completely different, it's something else. So this keyboard is ephemeral, is not tangible, okay? And the same holds true for other things, like these guys. Maybe some of you remember when we used to go to the music store and buy LPs, right? You could browse through the shelves, you know, and with these beautiful covers, and you could smell them, and you could touch the vinyl. You could pull the vinyl out and check that it was okay before you bought it. Remember that? Okay. Well, of course, we don't do that anymore. You can, but what we do most likely today is just go to some online store and then buy music on the store and download it, right? So what's interesting for me is that the assumption is completely changed. It's no longer me going into the shop. It's the store coming to me. Wherever I am, I can bring the store into the palm of my hands, wherever I am, because the store is completely ephemeral now. We buy ephemeral goods with ephemeral money. We have an ephemeral sales assistant that is probably going to suggest me what I should buy depending on my previous purchases or depending on what is trending, what other people are buying. I can browse a full catalog. So it's no longer me going into the store. Is the store coming into the palm of my hand because it's an ephemeral concept now. Other examples, of course, are books. Very easy to make the comparison, but also devices. I drove here, and I used a navigator. I didn't use a compass and a map, a physical map. I just used a navigator, which was an ephemeral thing inside of this device. Okay. Same concept. So this idea of doing more and more with less and less until you can do everything with nothing is not so far from reality, especially in our industry, which is heavily based on working with something which is completely intangible, like software. So well, I'd like to challenge some of the assumptions. For example, economical assumptions. And I have a question for you. It's a rhetorical question, but how much do you think it would take in terms of cost, I mean money, and time to change this keyboard layout? So what I'm saying, let's assume that for some reason IBM decides that the enter key is too small and some people are having a hard time hitting the enter key, which, by the way, is what happens to me all the time when I use this keyboard. Okay, that key is too small for me. Okay, so if they decide that that design wasn't right and they want to improve it, they could do it technically. All they would have to do is to recall all the keyboards and provide some substitute in the meantime. Okay? They will need to redesign the hardware, redesign the circuits, redesign the keys, replace the keys, and then resend the keyboards out. So technically it's possible. Financially, it's completely impossible. It makes no sense financially, but technically it's possible. How much would it take to change this keyboard layout in terms of time and cost and distribution? A fraction of that. Okay? An incredibly smaller fraction of that, which means that the economics behind the development and distribution of the products are completely changed. But we are still using some of the assumption that we use for tangible products, non-ephemeral products. Now, the implications, for example, are twofold. One implication is that now that change is generally easier and cheaper, our clients, our user, they rightly ask for change, especially because their world is changing all the time. It could be the external conditions for them could have changed, or the internal conditions could have changed. For example, they learn something about the way they work or the way or what they want. They discovered something internally, or maybe something changed externally, and they ask for change. And this is happening more and more frequently. And they rightly ask for that. The implication for us is that our targets are constantly moving. We need to constantly adjust to a target, to a goal, which is moving all the time, which is perfectly fine. Another implication is this one, is that now that, well, you can read the statement, but basically, if you invest in something which is cheap enough that you can afford to take a loss, then maybe you can become more risky. That's the concept, okay? Which is, by the way, what the music industry and the publishing industry and the movie industry, in general, all publishing, is doing all the time, which is why I chose that example for ephemeralization. Did you notice, for instance, that in the last 15 years, more 10, 15 years, the average quality of music out there has decreased? I mean that there is a lot of music out there, and there is still good music here and there, but it is much harder to find, right? Did you notice that? Yeah? Now, the reason is that that industry is exactly applying this principle. They're saying, well, today producing a record is much cheaper than it was 20 years ago. Today, for example, you can create 95% of a record in your home studio, and then you go to a professional production studio just for the last 5%, or post-production, okay? And distribution is much cheaper because now people download music. We don't need to ship around huge trucks with LPs and stuff. So production is cheaper, distribution is cheaper. And so what they do is basically saying, okay, you know what? I think this year I will produce 100 records. I know that very likely I will take a loss on 90 of those. But I also know that the 10% which is profitable pays for the loss which I'm taking on the other 90%. It's already happening, okay? That's what they do. Now, my point is, why shouldn't we do that as well? Why shouldn't we create software products in such a way, trying experiments, trying to put something out? If it is useful to people, if people like it, that's fine. If we take a loss, that's fine, okay? Up to a certain point, of course, up to a certain point. But this idea that you can have a roadmap for your product, for example, like an 18 months roadmap for your product, maybe it's not applicable all the time. Sometimes that's exactly what you need, but I'm arguing that maybe those are exceptions. They're not the general rule today. So a couple of assumptions, expectations that I'm challenging here is The first one is that things will not change, and the second one is that you can have predictable financial payoffs, which in my opinion are both false most of the time. Most of the time. Now, the second concept I'd like to talk about is uncertainty, which is something we have to, it's connected, of course, to what I've already told you, but it's something that we need to face every day. And I'd like to give another real-life example of this. The picture you see here is part of the particle accelerator in Geneva, the Large Hadron Collider in Geneva. Okay? So they do experiments on antimatter. It's a very big device. It's about 20 kilometers in diameter. So it's a pretty big device. Okay? And as you can imagine, using this device is a bit expensive. I mean, you don't turn it on just to give it a try. You follow a strict plan for your experiments, because every time you turn the switch on, that's a lot of money. Okay? So you have a very good plan. What's interesting is that a couple of years ago, the experiments on antimatter were slowed down. They need to change their plans, and they are in Geneva, because in Thailand, it rained a lot. So let me tell you again. Floods in Thailand, no antimatter experiments in Geneva, right? The reason is that these experiments collect a large amount of data, about 50 petabytes of data for one single experiment. Okay? And then, of course, they need to store all those data somewhere on hard disks. And who's the larger manufacturer of hard disks on the planet? Thailand, which was flooded. Okay? So no hard disks. No hard disks, no experiments. This is just to give you an idea of how much interconnected is the society in which we are working today. So this concept of predicting what will happen is become harder and harder our predictions are becoming less and less reliable. What I'm saying is I doubt that in their plans in Geneva, they had something in their, maybe a Gantt chart, I don't know, saying, okay, well, floods in Thailand, this could slow down our experiments. I strongly doubt that. But it happened, okay? This, of course, is a very radical example, but I'm sure you know what I'm talking about. So, which brings me to another example, which is weather forecasts or forecasts in general. This rendering here, it's an atmospheric satellite for basically weather prediction. And it's one of the satellites that the NOAA, which is a National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration in the US, use to gather data about the climate on the planet. They also have sensors on the ground, in the sea, and so on and so on. They have huge networks of computers. They have thousands of mathematicians creating mathematical models of the weather on the planet. So it's a large organization. And their mission is to monitor, understand, predict, and communicate climate changes on the planet. Very large mission. Okay? So if you want to know, for example, what's the weather going to be in Florence, Italy, in a couple of days, one option that you have is to ask the NOAA. Okay? Okay, what do you guys think? How's the weather going to be in Florence in a couple of days? And they will tell you. That's one option. The other option is to ask this guy, Gianfranco. And Gianfranco is a farmer who, for the last 40 years of his life, has been farming the fields around Florence. And if you ask Gianfranco doesn't use satellites. Okay? Doesn't have networks of computers, doesn't know anything about mathematical models. But if you ask Gianfranco, okay, what do you think the weather is going to be in a couple of days? He will tell you, and I'm pretty sure that it could be sometimes even more accurate than the NOAA, or sometimes not. But they are comparable, right? Of course, if you ask Gianfranco, what's the weather going to be in Zagreb, he has no clue. NOAA still has a clue. Gianfranco doesn't, okay? But there's another difference. Gianfranco is a bit cheaper than the NOAA. The NOAA is a bit more expensive than Gianfranco. So my point here is, if you're interested in the weather in Florence, you could either take one approach, empirical, or you could take another approach, very scientific and more expensive, and you could get some kind of results about your about the prediction of the weather. But my question for you, and of course, then again, it's a rhetorical question. You can answer the question in the intimacy of your own brain, if you wish. Okay? But the question is, if you were to know about the weather in Florence in a couple of days, who would you ask to? And who would you trust more? And if you decide that you trust Gianfranco more or the NOAA more, my question to you is why? Why do you take that approach and not the other one? Why do you think one is better than the other? Then again, it's a rhetorical question. I cannot take answers in this context, but I'd like to talk about that if you want offline. So my point is, we have to deal with uncertainty. And sometimes we put a lot of effort, like the NOAA, for example, in trying to find ways, very expensive ways to deal with uncertainty. But there are other approaches which are much cheaper and at the same time reliable in the same measure. So then again, it's just I'm just trying to give you food for thought, okay, at this point, at this time. I have another question for you. If we decide that it's perfectly fine to accept that the weather is not really predictable, for example, the weather guys, they use what we call rolling forecasts, right? If you ask them what the weather is going to be here in Tueli in about half an hour, I can tell you, okay, half an hour, it's almost 100% probability that's going to be sunny, maybe a little foggy. Okay? If you ask them, how about tomorrow? Oh, okay, maybe 90% probability of something. If you ask 1 month from now, no clue. No clue. Okay? It's probably hotter. Okay? It will be probably hotter because the planet has moved a little bit. Okay? But we don't know. We don't really know. We don't know if it's going to be raining or sunny or whatever. Okay? They don't know. But if you ask them in 3 weeks from now, what's the weather is going to be 1 month from now, they can tell you, okay, 50% probability that's going to be sunshine. So that's what we call the rolling forecast. In software development, very few of us have this idea of rolling forecast. We try to estimate. Actually, Vasco, right after me, is going to talk about the no estimate movement. Okay? But we try to estimate. In fact, we could use the same approach. We could use rolling forecasts. There are companies, large corporations who do. For example, Siemens. I spoke once with the head of the portfolio management department in Siemens. So they basically manage a large number of interconnected projects. They have no idea if all of these projects can stay on schedule for the next 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 1 month, 2 months, 3 months. So what they do is every few weeks they reassess the probability of delivery of certain functionalities into their applications. They reassess the probability every few weeks, exactly like they do with the weather forecast. They reassess the probability. They don't give estimates or certainties. They reassess the probability. Okay? So what I'm talking about is this dilemma in our brain between predictability versus adaptability. Okay? Do I want to stay in this nice hallucinated state in which I think that everything is predictable, or do I want to take the red pill and face reality and accept that we need to deal with uncertainty every day? That's another question I have for you. So if we bring that into software development, I would like to make another analogy. Frequently in what we do, we talk about roadmaps. I mentioned early the 18-month roadmap for the product, right? Okay, let's go back to the navigator example. Let's say that I ask some navigational system the direction from the Moscone Center in San Francisco to Fort Mason in San Francisco, which is a very nice place on the bay, okay? I'm in at the Moscone Center. I just came out of the conference and I want to go on the bay and relax for a while. And I want to go to the Moscone Center. I can use some kind of navigational system like this one, and it could give me this kind of instructions. Now, many people in software development, they do something like that. They try to plan ahead what they're supposed to be doing, and then they create a roadmap, more or less like this one. Well, to me, but also to Gojko Adzic, okay, this is not a roadmap. These are driving instructions, which means you go there, then you take a left, go on for a little while, then stop, then take a right, then go on, and then eventually you will reach your target destination. Assuming the target hasn't moved in the meantime, because we are talking about moving targets, okay? So first of all, this is not a roadmap. This is a predefined plan which I'm supposed to follow without knowing anything about changing conditions, because we also have to deal not only with moving targets, but also with uncertainty, okay? So this could be a roadmap. This is really a roadmap. It's a map of roads. That's why we call it a roadmap, okay? It's a map of roads. And a map of roads, it's a set of options that we can decide to use at every single moment. For example, the blue line over there is my intended plan, but if I have real-time traffic updates, for example, and while I'm driving, I receive an update saying, you know what, Columbus, don't go there, big accident, blocked. Take another route, okay? And have this kind of real-time traffic information, then I can use another option. I can take another path to reach my target, assuming the target is staying the same, okay? Or maybe I could say, oh, damn, that's blocked, that's too long. Tell you what, I'll change my target, okay? I'll go to Starbucks over there and have a coffee. And that's also fine, right? I adapt to what's going on. So why shouldn't we do that in software as well? Why shouldn't we accept the fact that we start a project with a certain target in mind, and that target can move, can change, or can become a completely different target, or we can also abort the mission and say, you know what, it's not working. Okay, let's do something different. A lot of startups started in a certain way with a certain idea in mind, and then they became something completely different. It's very common for startups. It's harder for large organizations. Now, Gojko is suggesting this approach, which I like. There's another one, which is called the real options. Okay? I'm not going to talk about real options, but I like impact maps, and I like to talk about that one. So, first of all, it's called impact map because Gojko is saying that we shouldn't try to make software. We should try to make impacts, meaning that we should try to change something, to make a difference for someone. Okay? And we can do that with software, of course, but our goal is to make an impact. He related a story in which he was running his own company, and they were very technically they were excellent, except that they ran out of money after a few months because the market wasn't buying into what they were doing. Okay? They were not making an impact. Okay? So an impact map is a way of representing your options. Are you guys familiar with impact maps? How many of you? So just a few. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you guys. Okay, an impact map, let me give you an example. In this example, we use this fictional company running an online game, okay, on the internet, on an online game. And the first level of an impact map is this one, which is more or less like a mind map. The first level is where you define the why you want to do something. So the first question is why. And in this example, this fictional example I'm giving you, the why is we want to reach 1 million players by the end of the year. That's their why. That's the impact they want to make. We want to do something that will make this impact on our company, 1 million users, 1 million players. Okay? The second level of an impact map is not why or what should I do, but who. Who can help us to make that impact, to reach that goal, to implement that vision, okay? Remember this word, vision. So, for example, advertisers, it's a possible group of people, or the current players are other people. So I'm talking about I'm not talking about technical things. I'm talking about carbon-based life forms, okay? Humans, people, okay? So the second question is, who can help us to reach that goal? The third question you ask is, let's take players, for example. Okay, how can they help us to make that impact? Well, for example, players, they can invite their friends to play the game. And that's one way to reach the goal, or to go closer to the goal. They can recommend using bookmarking. They could post on social networks, okay? And that's the third level. So why, who, and how. And only at the last point, at the fourth level, you start asking yourself, what should I do then? For example, if I want to enable my players to invite their friends, what should I do? Well, I could create viral content, I could have a more compelling product, blah, 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 blah. That's the what, okay? But, so you see how we start from a vision, and then we explore different groups of people that can help us, and the ways they can help us, and only at the last point, we decide what to do. All of these, at this level, these become options, things that we can try to do, okay? So it's no longer a plan. This is a roadmap. This is a list of different options that I can use anytime to try to reach my goal. And it's also even better if you can validate these options running fail fast and fail safe experiments. Meaning that since you remember, I mentioned that we live in an uncertain world, so it's not guaranteed that what you do at this level will have an impact on the why. Maybe you can try a short and cheap experiment and see if it works. You don't invest too much money. You do the simplest thing you can do at this level, and if it generates some interesting return, then you proceed. If it doesn't, you try something else. Okay? You keep your options open, basically. So that was the second thing I want to talk about. The first one, ephemeralization, and the way ephemeralization changes the financials and the economics of what we do, okay? And it challenges some of the assumptions about predictable financial payoffs and the stability of the future. Then I talked about uncertainty, and I suggested that if you use options and you keep your options open in a very structured way, but you keep your options open, maybe you can adapt better to a changing environment. And the third thing, which was mentioned in the introduction, was knowledge. But I need some help first. Now, since we started a bit later, I need to know how much time I have left. Can I ask the organizers, how much time do I have left?
10 to 15 minutes.
You're kidding me. Okay, how about 15? Okay, thank you. Okay, knowledge. Okay, I think it's clear to everyone in this room that our industry is a knowledge-based industry, right? We are knowledge workers. So I took the liberty to check out what knowledge worker is, and apparently there is no clear definition of knowledge work, but someone is suggesting that knowledge work is dealing with non-routine tasks using a combination of convergent, divergent, and creative thinking. That's one possibility, okay? Now, knowledge work is very different from labor. Right? For example, one difference for us in our industry is that we no longer think, or we should no longer be thinking in terms of the individual, because the level of complexity of these non-routine tasks that we are faced with every day is so high that it's very hard that one single person can tackle into a complicated problem in a reasonable business time. Let me translate. I could decide that I will write an application to manage the air traffic over Europe, okay, just by myself. I could do that, and it will probably take me the next 40 years of my life, okay? And by then, it's completely useless, right? So we need teams, we need people, we need collective intelligence. Okay? We need to bring people into the same room and help them think as one. Okay? That's why we say that the team is the basic unit of work. And if you really want to measure something, you don't measure individual productivity, you measure the team productivity. Okay? It's a social unit. Okay? So that's one difference. Another thing I did was to take these two words, knowledge work, and split them into knowledge and work. Now, for me, at the work level, there are concepts like visualizing what we do. Since we are working with ephemeral products, we cannot see the product. I mean, we can see the code, but the code is not what they buy from us. They buy the solution. They buy the impact that the code is making, not the code itself. Okay? So that's completely intangible. So we need to be able to visualize that. We need to get feedback, because using feedback, like with the navigator and the real-time traffic instruction or traffic updates, we can take decisions as we go. So we need that. We need to be able to measure queues and limit the working process. But basically, well, David talked about queues this morning. I hope so. So you know that you need to be aware of the workflow and how things are moving, considering that they are not measurable. And then measuring what really matters. Now, what do I mean by measuring what really matters? Sometimes we fall into this trap of measuring what is easy to measure and not what really matters. A classic example, we measure how many hours a person spent at the office, okay? Which is completely useless unit in terms of what that person actually did during those hours. But it's so easy to measure that we measure that, okay? Rather than measuring the actual value that was produced by the team, for example, we measure how many hours they spent in the room. That's an example of measuring what not matters, but it's easy to measure. At the knowledge level, I believe that there are other things, like, for example, collaboration and learning and clearly defined roles, which are not boxes, but they are a set of responsibilities that should be clear for everyone. Soft skills, self-organization, deep dialogue, okay? Deep dialogue. I find, for example, that we spend a lot of time for what we do in meetings, but the kind of conversation that usually goes on in those meetings is very functional, but still very superficial. We rarely go down deep and try to understand what's going on below the surface. For example, a client of mine recently, they spent a lot of time arguing which team should do what. And there's constant, finger pointing. You should have done that. No, that was my responsibility. That was your responsibility, blah, 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 blah. But their conversation never goes deep. Like, for example, okay, what can we do? Why are we behaving like this? Why are we not being constructive in the way we work together? Okay? It doesn't happen very often. So, of course, all of this is related to organizational culture. And for me, there are two interesting components that can influence the organizational culture. Dude, I'm going to be late. Sorry, man, we started a bit late. Two interesting components that can influence the organizational culture. The one, of course, is leadership. And for me, leadership, I want to make sure that you're not confusing managers with leaders, right? Managers, they take care of a number of things, and leaders are those who can have more influence on other people. Okay? They influence people. They don't direct people. They influence people. I believe that in the kind of knowledge work that we do, a leader is someone who is completely different from the classical, let's say classical leaders that we have seen. For example, these are some of the qualities that I find useful in leaders for knowledge-based environments, like valuing diversity of everything, opinions, gender, skills, and so on, encouraging trusting and learning, and facilitating deep understanding, and so on and so on and so on. So that's one component. It's a completely different approach to leadership. And then, oops, sorry, messed up. Yep. And of course, there are forms of, let's say, leadership that don't really work in that context. Like, for example, heroes, leaders who take on their shoulders the responsibility for saving the world, okay? And which is okay. I mean, sometimes we need heroes, but probably not all the time. Problem is, people then they become lazy because there's the hero that's saving us all the time. Or dictators, okay? Or prima donnas. I'm so much better than all of you guys, okay? Masters of puppets, okay? People who like to manipulate other people. Those approaches to leadership don't really work there. Usually you have this person in the front and a number of confused people in the back. But there's another component. I was talking about organizational culture. I was talking about leadership. And the second thing is this one, is personal responsibility, which I more and more look at as one of the more missing parts of the organizational culture. Now, what is personal responsibility? One of the things I did in my life was that thing, okay? Not at this level, because this is a professional team. I used to dive alone, but I did that. And it was very clear to me when you jump out of the plane and you find yourself out there, it was very clear to me that it was my responsibility for being there in the first place. And it was my responsibility for being technically, mentally, and physically prepared to get back to the ground safely. And it was entirely my responsibility. Totally my responsibility. If in that context I started having thoughts like, I shouldn't be here, it was that guy's fault, okay? Or, of course I'm here, well, I read so many books about skydiving and now I find myself here. Or, this kind of thinking, it's entertaining for a while, but, after a couple of minutes, the reality is going to approach you very fast. And you find that maybe there are more interesting thoughts that you can have, more useful thoughts. Like, okay, it's my responsibility for being here. What do I do now? Okay? Now, this kind of responsibility, I don't know if you guys are familiar with the work of Christopher Avery and the responsibility process. If you are not, I would suggest that you take a look at it if you like. He suggested a very simple, not simple, but very clear model for personal responsibility. So Christopher Avery, responsibility process. So what I'm trying to say is that if here, in this situation, I went into thoughts like denial. Oh, I'm not here. It's impossible that I'm here. Denial, blaming someone else, finding excuses for being there, or feeling ashamed for being here, or feeling some kind of obligation to someone that brought me there. No, it's useless. When I take personal responsibilities, when I'm in a position to make choices, create and attract. That's how Christopher Avery defines personal responsibility. It's an internal space in which you can choose, attract, and what did I say? And create. Okay? Create, attract, and make choices. I believe that we strongly need to improve the quality of personal responsibility in leaders and non-leaders in all of our organizations. So the Wetware update, since the title of this talk was Update Your Wetware, and the Wetware is what we have in our brain, so I'm just trying to stimulate different perspectives in your brain about what we do. What is the Wetware update? Basically what I'm trying to say is that our old inefficiencies, like approaching projects with the usual cost, time, and scope approach with the heroic leader and the confused team, is very inefficient. And it's inefficient on two levels. First of all, this is not true. This is going to fail because of the things I've told to you about uncertainty and financial payoffs and so on. This is going to fail, and this is sub-optimized. We have this part of the system who is doing something relevant, and this other part of the system who is very confused and doing nothing. Sub-optimization. Okay? And, by the way, there is no why. It happens very frequently to me that I speak to people in companies, different companies, and I ask them, okay, so why are you doing this? Because that's what we do. That's okay. And why do you do what is that you are doing? Okay, that's because we do that. Okay. So there is no vision. What I'm trying to say is there is no vision. There is no direction. There is no impact to make. And of course, there is no very good alignment in that case. So there is no why as well. A different model could be this one, which basically summarizes everything that I told to you. Use options. Keep your options open. That's one possibility. Use rolling forecasts rather than trying to estimate and follow a predefined plan. Okay. Accept that your targets are moving and learn to follow your targets as you go using feedback and other things. Try to create social units of work, create real teams, and have leaders that can take care of all of these, supporting the initiative and supporting the team, and not by imposing. And first of all, and most importantly, have vision directing what you do. At all levels in the organization, have vision. So, in short, the few things I've mentioned are, you might want to challenge your expectations. You may want to learn to use uncertainty to your advantage and cultivate vision as your guiding beacon. Measure things that really matter so that you can have reliable and useful information that can help you along the way, and understand and foster social units of work. So I'm almost done, but I would like to spend 30 seconds to close with a quote from someone who I think accomplished something, quite a few things in his life, including this one. He made the Sistine Chapel in Rome, so I'm talking about Michelangelo. Okay. And Michelangelo apparently said this, that the greater danger for most of us lies not in setting our aim too high and miss, but in setting our aim too low and hit. Okay. So if it looks challenging to you, I don't know, maybe give it a try. Maybe it will work. Okay. So I think I'm done, and I think I'm almost on time. Okay. Thank you very much. And then again, my name is Andrea Provaglio. There are a couple of websites. If you'd like to keep in touch, which I'd love to, you can find me on LinkedIn, you can find me on Twitter, you can find me on SlideShare. And since a few of you guys were taking pictures, these slides are already on SlideShare. Just search for my name on SlideShare. Okay? And thank you very much. Window, if you want. I never tried that, but I suspect it could work. Okay? So it was a very interesting piece of hardware. And this one is one of the keyboards which I use today. Now, for me, what's interesting is not that it's lighter and smaller. What is really interesting is that there is no keyboard, right? There is the glass surface, which sometimes I use as a keyboard, but sometimes it's completely different, something else. So this keyboard is ephemeral, is not tangible, okay? And the same holds true for other things, like these guys. Maybe some of you remember when we used to go to the music store and buy LPs, right? You could browse through the shelves, and with these beautiful covers, and you could smell them, and you could touch the vinyl. You could pull the vinyl out and check that it was okay before you bought it. Remember that? Okay. Well, of course, we don't do that anymore. You can, but what we do most likely today is just go to some online store and then buy music on the store and download it, right? So what's interesting for me is that the assumption is completely changed. It's no longer me going into the shop. It's the store coming to me. Wherever I am, I can bring the store into the palm of my hands, wherever I am, because the store is completely ephemeral now. We buy ephemeral goods with ephemeral money. We have an ephemeral sales assistance that is probably going to suggest me what I should buy depending on my previous purchases or depending on what is trending, what other people are buying. I can browse a full catalog. So it's no longer me going into the store. It's the store coming into the palm of my hand because it's an ephemeral concept now. Other examples, of course, are books. So there are three things I'd like to talk to you today. There are three concepts. The first one is called ephemeralization. It's a very, very big word. It took me 5 minutes to learn to pronounce it, actually. Okay. The thing is, rather than try to just point you in some direction, I would like more to challenge some of the assumptions that we have in our industry with practical examples. So this is one of these examples, and I'd like also to talk about the implications. Now, this thing called ephemeralization was introduced by this gentleman, Mr. Richard Fuller, who was an architect, an inventor, and a philosopher. And the concept is very easy to make the comparison, but also devices. I drove here, and I used a navigator. I didn't use a compass and a map, a physical map. I just used a navigator, which was an ephemeral thing inside of this device. Okay. Same concept. So this idea of doing more and more with less and less until you can do everything with nothing is not so far from reality, especially in our industry, which is heavily based on working with something which is completely intangible, like software. So I'd like to challenge some of the assumptions. For example, economical assumptions. And I have a question for you. It's a rhetorical question, but how much do you think it would take in terms of cost, money and time, to change this keyboard layout? So what I'm saying, let's assume that for some reason IBM decides that the Enter key is too small and some people is apparently quite ambitious. The concept is do more and more with less and less until you can do everything with nothing. Okay? Sounds strange, right? But I think that especially in our industry, we are masters of ephemeralization. It's happening in architecture as well, building architecture as well. But in our industry, I think we are master of that. And I'll give you an example. Now, the thing that you can see on the screen, that was one of the keyboards that I used 25 years ago. And it was one of the keyboards I used because the shirt on the picture was mine. Okay, it was me in the picture. But I will save you the rest of the picture, okay? Just a keyboard. And that was one of the keyboards that I used. It was an IBM 3270 terminal, and the keyboard was an interesting piece of hardware, very substantial piece of hardware. It was made of solid steel. It weighed about 5 kilos. You could probably use it to break through a jewelry